Hi, I'm Ann and welcome to LearnHowToQuilt.com. Today I'm going to show you how to make this paper piece spool, and then I'll show you how to turn it into a quilt label. So come on in and let's get started. You can download the directions and pattern at LearnHowToQuilt.com, or you can click on the links below. You'll need scraps of fabric about 4 to 6 inches long for the spool thread and maybe 5 to 6 inches long for the caps. I use this 8.5 by 11 inch piece of freezer paper. Usually I buy rolls of freezer paper and then cut 8.5 by 11 sheets, but someone gave me this pack and I thought I'd try it out. So to make the label, you'll need one 8.5 by 11 inch sheet of freezer paper along with the background fabric cut just a tad smaller. You'll also need an inkjet printer. To get started, you'll want to cut out a paper piece pattern. Use a postcard or an old card to fold on the lines. Folding weakens the paper, so it's much easier to tear it out later on. It also helps with fabric placement. When you paper piece, you'll be sewing on these lines and placing your fabric on the back, which takes a little bit of practice to get used to. Before I begin, I usually like to figure out the order that I'm going to place my scraps. So let's see, something like that. But it's not necessary. I could just start pulling from these piles. These spools usually look good in just about any fabric combo. I'll start with fabric number 1, which is this fabric in the middle here. Since I'll be sewing on this line, I'll put the fabric on the back over number 1. And just to make sure that I've got it in the right place, let's see, I'll put a pin here. And then I can hold this up to a window or another light source. And you can see that there's extra fabric all the way around number 1 because that's going to be your seam allowance. So if that looks good, I'm ready for fabric number 2. Fabric number 2 is right here. It's going to go right here, but to sew, I've got to put right sides together. Let me turn this over. And I like to double check to make sure I've got that fabric placed in the right spot. So I pin on the seam line between 1 and 2. That's where I'm going to be sewing. I come back over here and I pull that fabric back. Now let me come on this side. I want to make sure that fabric number 2 covers this line and this line, and there's more than enough there. So everything looks good, and I'm ready to sew on this line. I'm using red thread so you can see, but you'll want to use a neutral color. If you're going to tear out the paper, you'll need to set your stitch length a little bit tighter. On this machine, it's about 1.5. I'm going to start stitching about 1 to 2 stitches past this line, and I'll continue stitching all the way through and then stop 1 to 2 stitches at the end of this line. Just follow that black line 1 to 2 stitches past, clip those threads. Now I can trim this here down to a 1/4 inch seam, or I can just leave it. I'll take fabric number 2, and you can take this over to the iron and press, or you just finger press it. Fabric number 3 goes right here. So it'll end up looking something like this. But I want to put right sides together in order to sew. Let me check over here. Take a pin and put it between 1 and 3, come back over here and pull that fabric back. Oh, and I might not have enough. So let's look. Am I going to clear? Does that fabric number 3? So I'll look and see, and I see that I've got enough fabric that covers this line here. So that'll be okay. Bring it over to my sewing machine. I'll start 1 to 2 stitches before the line. and stitch right down that line. Clip the threads. I want to clip out this seam allowance, so I'll fold the pattern down and eyeball about 1/4 inch. Take fabric number 3 and finger press it back. Before adding fabric number 4, I want to show you another way to do this. Some folks like to fold the pattern back on the next sew line, which is right here, and then eyeball about 1/4 inch seam and trim. Fabric number 4 goes here. I'm going to put right sides together, and this time I'm going to line that fabric up with the other fabric that I just trimmed. I know that I'm going to have extra all the way around, so I'm not even going to bother to check. Just going to take this to my sewing machine. Whoops. Take this to my sewing machine. Got to sew on the side with the lines. And finger press it back. Here's fabric number 5. Let's try that again. I'll fold this down and I'll eyeball about 1/4 inch seam. Fabric number 5 is going to go right here, so I'll put right sides together and stitch. Fold this back and finger press. Before I add the side pieces, I'd like to hit this with an iron. Now I'm ready to add these side pieces. So fabric number 6 is going to go right here, and I like to fold this back to trim that out, but there's stitches here. So you might have to tear it just a little bit to get that folded down. Eyeball your 1/4 inch seam. Fabric number 6 is going to go here. Put right sides together and stitch. I'm starting 1 to 2 stitches before this line, and I'll end 1 to 2 stitches after this line. Finger press it. This fabric should go past this little dotted line. Now, I don't know if you can see, but there's a shadow there from that orange fabric. So I like to go back in and trim it a little bit more. Make sure that I don't see that shadow. I'm not trimming the white. I'm just trimming that orange. That's a little bit better. I'll repeat this process on the other side. To add the cap, fold back the paper and trim. Put right sides together, and this time I want to start outside of that dashed line. So I started outside the dash, went all the way across past the dashed line. Fold this back, repeat with the last one. I trimmed this block and then tore off the paper, but I forgot to turn on the camera. So here's another block. I'll use this block to show you what happens next. Make sure your block's been pressed with the hot, dry iron. If you're going to leave the paper on, what I like to do is stitch between the finished size and the seam allowance. I just stitch a line straight around, and that'll hold this fabric in place. And that works great if you're going to use this for a card, because the paper makes it easier to slide that into that frame. I'm planning on using this for a label, so I want to tear all that paper off. The first thing I need to do is trim it. Trim on that dashed line. To remove the paper, put my finger over that stitch line and start tearing. The first piece is usually the hardest. Once that one comes out, then it's pretty easy to tear out the rest. If you have little pieces still stuck, you can remove them with your fingers or a tweezer, or just leave them in. I don't think anyone will notice. And there's my completed spool. First, you'll need a label to print. These are the same size as a spool, so they can be sewn on the top and bottom or on either side. I'm printing 2 labels so as not to waste any fabric on just one. I typed up these quilt labels using my computer. if you're not sure how to do that, I made a generic set here that you can download at learnhowtoquilt.com and fill it in with your own information. Next, you'll want to get your fabric and paper ready for printing. Here's my freezer paper, and I've cut this just a tad smaller. Let's put this on here. You can barely see. And the reason why I cut it just a little bit smaller is I don't want any of this fabric hanging over when I put it through my printer. So I'll take this to the ironing board. I want to make sure I've got the shiny side up against my fabric, and I'll press. I've pressed my paper to my fabric. I like to lay this down and just check to see if there's any fabric on the edges. And I see right here, there's just a little sliver of fabric, so I'll trim that off with my rotary cutter just to make sure it doesn't get caught up when I put it in the printer. Load your fabric, usually face down, into your printer and print. And here's my label. I'll just peel this back and then cut this out. You can sew a label on top of the spool like this, or on the side, or try something different. To applique this to the back of the quilt, I've cut a rectangle out of that freezer paper that I just used. I'll take this, turn it over, and press that to the back, like so. That makes it easier for me when I go to applique. If you're worried that the backing of your quilt will show through the fabric on your label, then instead of using this paper, you can try an iron-on interfacing. It will provide a guide for you for the edges of the applique, and it'll block the backing fabric from showing through. Pin it in place and then stitch. I'm almost finished appliquing this label in place. If there's freezer paper inside, I want to remove it at this point when I've got the 2 corners stitched down and 3 of the sides. I just reach in here and pull it out, and then turn this under and finish stitching. And here's my completed label. I finally got a label on this quilt that I completed a while ago. Hope you get a chance to try one of these spools, either in a card, on a label, a luggage tag, or some other project. You'll find links below with videos to more ideas for spools. Let us know if you decide to try one. Contact me at ann@learnhowtoquilt.com or leave us a comment below. Thanks for visiting learnhowtoquilt.com. Please like, share, and subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, but it sure could help this channel. Thanks.